Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. On this episode, I carry on with this series on relationships and thinking loosely about the way in which dynamics, interpersonal dynamics, can create patterns that operate implicitly within our lives. And as a result, we repeat things that, because they're repeated, feel familiar and feel in a sense that they are the right path or they are authentic. Yet, the way in which these patterns were constructed may have been the result of, and were in whatever way the result of, intersecting situations, dynamics, environmental issues, physiological and biological issues, sociological issues. All sorts of different things were coming together in a complex matrix that created a context that we then adapted to. And the solution that we found to cope was our way of dealing with and moving forward. So I jotted down at the end of the last session I recorded the implicit bias of the, quote, solution, unquote, as assertion to dismiss complexity. Add to which the felt sensation of the anxiety is the feeling of the truth, which overrides connection through fear. So this is my reminder of what I wanted to speak about in this episode. And so I'll work from the back, this idea of connection, this idea of fear, and how anxiety can override connection. So if we think about how we can feel rejected in a relationship. Now, it can be with a partner, it can be a work relationship, a familial relationship. That experience of rejection breaks our connection, or has the potential to break our connection. And that elicits within us a feeling, a sense of not being safe, that lost connection. And when that connection is lost, we scramble in whatever way to address it. So we can talk in terms of an immobility response or a mobility response. So what this means is we may freeze or in some way stop, numb ourselves, or we may activate. That means we may pursue or engage or fight and so on. These are responses that are coming from this implicit sensation of this lost connection. And in relationships that we are experiencing now, when this comes up for us, what can be happening is, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of patterns. These patterns can reemerge and project into the current experience in our lives. So, as an example, let's say you grow up in an environment where your parents are quite erratic. And then later on, many years, let's say you're in university, let's even say you're in grad school, you have a professor who is quite erratic. You might find yourself feeling things that are really overwhelming and perhaps disproportionate to the kind of uncertainty that's going on within your experience in school, or similarly within a work environment where you are feeling like a boss is being, or a manager is being in some way quite erratic, which is true, yet your felt experience of that erratic behavior is amplified by your previous earlier experiences. And if we recall how within these previous earlier experiences, we are, of course, younger. And if we think about the way in which when we're younger, often these things feel quite dynamic. So, for example, I'm 50, and my background, I started as a musician in my teens. I started gigging in my kind of mid to late teens, and so much of my firsts happened between, say, 15 and 23 or so, or 25, let's say. So those 10 years. Those imprinted upon me in a way that 25 to 35 did not. And it's not because I didn't do things from 25 to 35, or for that matter, 35 to 45. It's that from 15 to 25, everything was a first. There was very little repetition in the grand sense. Of course, I was repeating and playing with certain people over and again, or certain venues over and again. But everything was this feeling of, this is now my life. I've arrived. I've come to this place I've imagined. So I offer this as an example, and perhaps you can think of a way in which a certain time in your life may still be quite present with you as being this felt experience of vitality, that the impression was quite vivid, quite strong. It doesn't need to be a series of stories or a telling of events in terms of, I did this, I did that, but more of a sense of how are you feeling when you're going through these firsts. And if we step back even further and we think, well, what's it like to imagine the first of being 5? What's it like to imagine the first of, being in school, being accepted or rejected? What's it like to experience this primary rupture in this case, the example of the parents who are erratic, and then later on that resonating within, let's say, a workplace that we're at. So what this tells us is that this idea of the past, that we get over things, may not be as valid a premise as we may want. And this kind of works us back to the beginning of the statement, which is the idea that the implicit bias is the solution, which is to say that the notion that the anxiety we're feeling is both the problem and solution means that in order to remedy or address, in this case, anxiety, we need to do something. And that can set us into a whole chain of events that is in and of itself a form of anxiousness, right? We're trying to get control. So an example of this might be a person feels like their life is falling apart, so then they engage in doing a whole bunch of things to correct this behavior. Now, correcting the behavior, what does that actually mean? Well, we don't really know. We're essentially guessing. And as much as we want to understand our anxiety, as much as we may want to correct our course or our trajectory, as much as we may want to feel better, what are the tools that we have in place? And where and from where do these tools arise? Well, if we are feeling a dysregulation and the tools are coming from this dysregulation, then the question is, can we really use those tools? And of course the answer is yes. But to what effect? So if we back up and we think, okay, well, on the one hand, I've got this implicit bias as a solution. And on the other hand, I've got this idea that the anxiety is a truth because it's a pattern that exists within my behavior. I'm beginning to paint a picture that might seem a little restrictive, meaning I seem to be saying, and I am in a certain way, that our patterns are locking us into certain behavioral responses that are measured within some form of, let's say, anxiety, and that the tools we use to try and step out of this anxiety is anxiety itself. And hence the paradox, right? How do you fight fire with fire? How do you fight anxiety with anxiety? And what I'm suggesting is this is an opportunity to look into the anxiety or the depression or the whatever it is and start to restructure it. So if we think of a kid acting out and the parent saying, why is my kid acting out? The parent is fundamentally unclear on how to understand the affect the child is experiencing, which the child is also unclear on how to express in terms of putting it into symbolic language, to say, I want this, I want that. So with a baby, a parent might say when the child is distressed, do you want your bottle? Do you want your blankie? Do you want and the child starts to get a sense of, when I'm feeling distressed, I want certain things. And these certain things have a tactile feel to them. They affect me in some way, like suckling or holding onto a blanket, They also have a symbolic dynamic, right? They have a name, right? And so they're called a bottle, or they're called a blankie. And now what happens is we're starting to structure our experience. This is true in our lives, no matter how old we are, that the implicit response, the anxiety meeting anxiety, is emphasizing that we have not yet found a way to articulate that which this anxiety is acting out to us. And in so doing, we have become effectively paralyzed by the enactment of uncertainty. And this is where we finally circle back to this idea of uncertainty and the way in which we can dismiss the complexity as a way to try and solve the problem. However, if the anxiety or depression, which are symptoms of this complexity, come back, it's telling us we have not yet been able to decipher, structure, in whatever way express, in a formalistic way, that which is driving us, this underlying angst. And I want to distinguish between anxiety and angst, if only to offer another way of thinking about, broadly speaking, angst as something that includes dynamics that would include depression, fears, and of course the angst or the tension that one feels when they feel compelled towards something and they're unable to resolve that dynamic with in whatever way that they would otherwise like to release themselves from that stress. So, for example, the anxiety of not knowing something, right? You would like to know it to release yourself from the stress of not knowing. And not knowing here is very much like being thrown into a state of complexity where there doesn't seem to be the pattern of answers that you are familiar with, like we were talking earlier, and instead there starts to be a break with your familiar patterns, which then means we're now in a situation where we're trying to understand something that we do not understand, and we are experiencing the phenomenon of uncertainty. And again, that points back to this idea of anxiety meeting anxiety as an illustration to us, as an effective illustration that there is more to explore. And this is where complexity and potential start to emerge. And within complexity and potential, we start to see the thing that holds us back fundamentally is the idea that we need to control. We need to have a concrete answer of that which is certain. However, if we remove that as a fundamental, if we say, well, we don't always have to know, then what that does is it allows this to operate in a way that is more akin to seeing things as what I refer to as fixed variables. So a fixed variable just means that we're coming to some understanding, but we're also understanding that that understanding is not an absolute understanding. So it is coming to a kind of plateau, but it's not something that we would say, aha, we've arrived, we're done. There's always this recognition that really what's happened is we've come to an evaluation or a judgment of something within time. And so the ontological experience of time, or the ordering of our experiences within time, is expressed through our realizations, or quote-unquote realizations, or judgments that are occurring when at certain points we say, it's this. So then one of the philosophical kind of questions is, if you define baldness as anybody with fewer than 1,000 follicles of hair, does that mean the person with 999 follicles of hair is bald? So there becomes this kind of arbitrary question of, well, when is it one thing, when is it another? And we can look at this in terms of, say, melting ice. When is it no longer ice? When is it water? All of these transformations, we may try and come up with ways to describe them. We may come up with linguistic ways to describe them in the same way that the child starts to understand that they're looking for their bottle, they're looking for their blankie. The individual starts to understand, okay, there are these intermediary steps. Here's a silly example. Is there a word to describe an in-between state where your shoelace is almost untied, but not quite untied? I say it's a silly example because we are doing this all the time. We are reacting to it. And in that moment, do you feel anxious? Do you feel like, oh, I should bend down and tie it up? I could trip and fall. I could hurt myself. So notice what's happening as we move away from the clear understanding of the shoe is tied to the shoe is not tied, but we don't actually have a concrete point at which everybody on earth says this time who's wearing shoes says, I have to tie or untie and retie my shoes to make sure I don't fall and hurt myself. And notice that the association is I'm going to fall and hurt myself, which is a form of understanding the experience through anticipation. So that anticipation is coming from something, which is why we can circle back to that example I was giving earlier, where if somebody grows up in an environment where the parents or the caregivers are erratic, and then later on in life they find themselves in school or in a work environment where that arises again, and that implicit fear starts to come into that school experience, that work experience, it then is an opportunity to reinterpret the anxiety that is as yet unprocessed. To use the shoe tying analogy, I can look down it and notice my shoe is almost untied and I could trip, and I could notice, oh, I'm really worried about falling and hurting myself. Where is that coming from? Clearly I can tie the shoe and remedy the situation, but I can ask more fundamental questions. Where is this fear coming from? And this fear overrides connection. This fear pulls us into those immobility or mobility responses, those implicit responses. And from there, we draw upon the patterns of our experience. So if we can untangle the responses, these implicit responses, and how this idea that there was this, let's say, childhood or whatever the point in our experience, whenever that was, whenever that occurred in our lives, and we can say, okay, everything is always happening all the time. And the question is, how can we address or approach these things in the here and now? So, for example, if we are feeling anxiety and we're able to connect or understand there is a connection to things that have occurred in our past, and that these things are occurring now, then it's no longer something that's occurring in our past, it's something that is occurring. And the labels that we use to delineate time, so to say something is, past, present, and future, in the same way to say is, 999 hairs is bald, 1,000 hairs is not, we can start to realize that's how we are interpreting and constructing an understanding of something that in and of itself does not abide by those structures. In other words, the language that we bring, the understanding that we bring, the comprehension that we bring is not fixed. And if we are operating from this embedded notion that we need to get to a fixed place, then are we not creating, almost like in a film, you could say it's foreshadowing, are we not foreshadowing anxiety, which then becomes the pattern? And this is kind of the point of the podcast, is the way in which these embedded patterns actually foreshadow the anxiety that people want to escape, which they do through repetition. And this is key when we start to thinking about the way in which, in psychological terms, repetition is a plea. It is, like I was saying about the child earlier, a kind of acting out. And it is looking for a form of symbolization, which means it is looking for a way to be brought into the construct of time that actually acknowledges the experience in a way that fits perfectly. This is why generic solutions don't work. They may work for a time, right? Turn your frown upside down and flip the script and all these kinds of things. They may offer a broad stroke cognitive shift. Yet, if we really start to move more deeply into the nuance of our experience, the uniqueness of our experience, and we begin to embrace the complexity of our own affect within which we are interconnected in ways that are really infinite, then we start to notice that this idea of a fixed self, that is really coming from our own need to define what is, by analogy, bald or not bald, or what is tied and what is not tied, to use the shoe analogy. But that is a form of constructing our reality, which may give us a sense of certainty to a point. But notice, what if yesterday's certainty turns into tomorrow's uncertainty? And what if there is no yesterday and tomorrow? In other words, what if all of these categories are actually limited by the experience which it is trying to convey? So I can think of it this way. If I'm trying to label a bunch of things, and I have a very specific language to label those things, that may work for a time. But if I start to notice that some things are not really as aligned within my categorical system as other things, what do? Do I ignore them, call them outliers, ignore them, denial, repression, all the rest of it? Or do I take them on and say, well, everything is everything all of the time? A kind of pluralism. Both are offering in some way a way to acknowledge that there is a change and that we have a relationship to change. However, what both are not doing is shifting the relational dynamic from the creative impetus or the intuitive impetus is actually what's guiding everything, and the intellectual impetus or the symbolic systems are trying to decipher, and they are engaged in a perpetual, eternal dynamic of deciphering these different interpersonal and intrapersonal dynamics. We are a changeless change. And I don't mean that as a platitude. I mean that in the sense that if we become bounded by our descriptions, then all we can see, there's the saying, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Or Wittgenstein had this saying about glasses. You're looking through a lens, but don't realize you're looking through a lens. Similarly, you're born into a culture. You don't necessarily realize the implicit bias that comes with being in one geographic location or the certain associations that you have. So, for example, here in Canada, you can go to different provinces and there's just different political positions, which are entirely unoriginal. You know that to be a person of a certain province, you're going to probably vote a certain way. And so that's an example of a social construct that people can then place themselves or embed themselves within to create really an inauthentic or bad faith sense of self. Because in Sartre's terms, you're operating within a structure where you're pretending or believing that you are not free, because you are believing or pretending that you exist within a structure and therefore you do not have choice. Right? So you lack the agency to acknowledge all of these implicit and explicit differences. So what does this have to do with couples? What does this have to do with our work relationships? What does that have to do more broadly with relationships? So I packed a lot into this. So now I want to slow things down a bit and say, if you took anything from what was said before, the only real idea that is perhaps helpful as we move towards the end of the podcast is the idea that things are not fixed, and that our assumptions and our own needs to have things be certain is actually a pointing hand or pointing finger towards an area of potential. So the distress we feel within that conflict might allow us to unpack this felt experience that is appearing before us, or I shouldn't, not appearing, we're experiencing in an embodied way. And this is, I think, a really quite unique and wonderful thing about the human experience, that we can heal and explore through our relationships times that have passed, in the sense that we can continue to grow and we continue to heal. If we think of, we break an arm or we harm ourselves in some way and we get some medication or we get a cast, and we start to see the healing potential. If we think about the way in which medicine can heal us, if we think about the way in which meditation can actually help us to develop a bodily awareness, all of these are ways to explore our experience and our connectedness. And the hurt that we have experienced in the past, where that connection was violated, and that we can now start to step into that uncertainty, which we've been really avoiding and afraid to approach. We can start to step into it and realize, or perhaps realize, that we can heal. Trauma is really about a wound, and interpersonal dynamics where we are wounded involve a need to heal. And in relationships, there can be an incredible potential to connect and heal. And this can happen in couples, this can happen in other relationships. So what I'm going to leave this podcast with is this idea that, can we find ways to explore these implicit solutions which are offering us a kind of answer, but really they're functioning more like a pause button. And if we can slow down, pause, and then start to open to this anxiety, this stress, what we are doing in that moment is we're modeling the form of acceptance and unconditional acceptance, empathy, that we had experienced as a desire that was not realized. In other words, we start to engage in a form of implicit holding that we had longed for but had not received. And the rupture is a kind of changeless change. Yes, it can happen in a traumatic context, but it is also the change and transformation that is the experience of our lives, that we are unfolding and progressing, and however we label it, that's separate. Thus, we need a space for discovery that was not allowed before, because in those relationships, there was not the attuned reciprocity, there was not the safe mutuality, there was not, simply put, the holding that allows for a person to discover their own expressive self. And this is the creation of self. That is, this is the creation of our own experience through our own intuition, brought into symbolic form. What stands out for me is how, when I was younger, I had a lot of certainty about things. And I spent a lot of time looking for the answer and thinking in terms of should and shouldn't and right and wrong. And the older I get, the less that seems just empirically true. I can't really look around the world and say, yep, bad things happen only to bad people and good people always rise to the top. I can't pretend that the kinds of complexities that exist in the world don't exist, or wish them away by saying they shouldn't exist. I appreciate that feeling that I have, that sense of unfairness, but how can I explore that unfairness within my own sense of lost connection? So I'll leave it there for now, and if there's any questions, you can always email me. You can find me at jordanoconnor.com. Other than that, thanks a lot. Bye for now.